Good morning. As I posted on the group, and as we discussed last week, and I'm going to be going through different sugyas, different so-called themes in Chassidus. Since you're learning individual Maimorim, each one of you, whatever your mokim shali bechafetz, and I know that yeshiva, in general, shurim weren't really given in the central themes. It was more like you had to figure it out yourself. And when you bring together all the different Maimorim, so first of all, you see the Chiddush that Chassidus Chabad, starting from the Alter Rebbe, contributes. And secondly, it's more opportunity to understand many different angles of the subject matter. Though there were tainas when Encyclopedia Talmudis was first created, and then Sefer Erchim by Rabbi or Vashalom, that the people are going to stop learning Maimorim because they're going to just look in the encyclopedias. So the Rebbe said by Fabrengen a number of times that Adrabah, because Teira Ruchem Eretz Midah Rechava Miniyam, so these indexes or mafteches, and the Rebbe himself made many mafteches, makes it easier to find the subject, but then you can use your extra time to go deeper into the sugyas. So obviously they're not meant to replace learning Chassidus, but still it puts things into context. So the best place to begin is with one of the most fundamental and Yuseidisdik subjects, and that is the musig of Ohr, or more specifically, Ohr Ain Sof. Now, of course, I was thinking first to begin with Atzmus, which is everyone's favorite topic, but I think it's much better to understand it through the context of Ohr. And it's always good to begin with a klotz kasha. You know, Chassidus, how many Maimorim talk about Ohr? There's no Maimer that doesn't mention Ohr somewhere. Whether it's Ohr Ain Sof, the Fnei Tzimtzum, or Acharat Tzimtzum, or the Ohr in Ak, or Akudim, or Nekudim, or Vrudim, or Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiya, Eris and Kalim. So you have to step back for a moment. The question that maybe you did ask, maybe you never asked, what is this inyan of Ohr? What is this exactly? The Eibush is not mukhrach in anything. So if he created Ohr, that means there has to be a reason for it. It has to serve a role. It's not there because it has to be there. So what role does it serve? And so to speak, you could ask the question, Fakert, if Ohr didn't exist, what would life look like? What would our existence look like? Would it make a difference to anyone here? If you've never heard of the concept of Ohr? So these are questions that usually are not asked in our regular shiurim, either for the reason that it's assumed that everybody knows already, but not lav dafka, as we know, most people don't have the answer. As I quoted last week, the letter from the Rebbe says that most of the klotz kashas, the basic Yuseidis, are never asked. And even people who know a lot of information don't have an answer to most fundamental question like that. Why do you need Ohr, and what's the role of Ohr? So, and I'll add one more question. What's the Chiddush of Chassidus in the inyan of Ohr? Did Ohr exist in the Sifrei Kabbalah and in the Chassidus HaKlolis and the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid? What are the Alter Rebbe, Chassidus Chabad, Chadash with Ohr? So yeah, I'm sure you know in the Maimorim it speaks about the difference in Ohr and Shefa. That in the Sifrei Kabbalah Rishonim they use the word Shefa. We use the word Ohr, Chassidus. So the difference is explained. This probably every one of you knows. But the question then is just a semantics. I mean, Shefa means a flow. Ohr means a reflection. They're both Misholim. They're both not physical. They're both reflecting a hashpah and hamshacha from Elokus. So why taka is the real difference? I mean, Chassidus says Shefa is not dovik to the moyer and all those differences. So I'm going to try to address all of that as best as possible in brief. That's always a sign. If you could say it, bekitzer, it means you understand it better. It takes like a famous guy that wrote a long letter to his friend and said, I apologize, I didn't have time to write a shorter letter. because to write short takes a lot more time than to say it barichas. And of course, with the main goal, the end is what is ma'af kamina b'peil, in aveda b'peil, my benayu. If there's there's no Ohr. So I gave a few marmikamis in the group, and the first place that really you find the chiddush of Ohr, let's start with just the technicalities, is in Ageres HaKedesh, Siman Chof. I should have written that as well, but I assumed that was a given, but I should have written it. Now, Ageres HaKedesh, Siman Chof, the Alter Rebbe wrote just a few weeks before his Distalkus. So here comes another thing. If that's where the first time the Alter Rebbe really discusses it, it's not the first time. I'll talk about it in a moment. But that's where there's you really see the chiddush of the Alter Rebbe. It's only 2 weeks before his Distalkus. That means Hol Chassidus Chabad was there before Ageres HaKedesh, Siman Chof, which itself is an interesting phenomenon, as I'll explain a little bit later. But there are Maimonim from the Alter Rebbe called Lahavin Inyan Ohr Ain Sof. I think I've counted maybe 6 or 7 such Maimonim, said different times. So you see that the Alter Rebbe himself went to explain what's the Inyan of Ohr Ain Sof. And each of the Maimonim are different. I'd say one that I'm going to refer to a lot is in Tzemach Tzedek, in Eira Teira Inyanim. And if you've learned Samach Vav, the Maimor Vayelach, Samach Vav, which is one of the fundamental Maimorim Chassidus B'chlal, is very much based on this Ageres HaKedesh and on this Lahavin Ohr Ain Sof from the Tzemach Tzedek. The reason I'm giving the Marmikemis is because, first of all, you can go look it up and you can see more details and see it. And second of all, to ground it, and it's not just based on Chassidish theories, that this is straight from the Alter Rebbe. In Vayelach Samavav, the Rebbe Rashab says a very strong expression. He says, "V'zech chidush Rabbeinu nishmaseid be'inyan ha'Ohr." That's the first place he hears that the Rebbe says that's a chidush from the Alter Rebbe in the inyan ha'Ohr. So what exactly then is this chiddush? And as I said, these Maimorim discuss it, but this still needs explanation because when you look at the Maimorim, they're a little dense and somewhat even cryptic. So let's start with the question before Ohr. In other words, Ohr is coming to resolve something. It wouldn't, as I said before, wasn't created for no reason. And it doesn't have to be. There's no hechrich. The shemesh must give off Ohr. That's what was created. L'hoyer ala oretz. It has no choice. But it's a nivra. Chaz v'shalom to say the Eibishter is muchrich to give off Ohr. Chassidus talks about this a lot. The Eibishter is not muchrich in anything, not Ohr and not b'riyah, nothing. And there's even an expression, Lo ze ikar elakush shenesavim mimena Ohr, Lo ze ikar elakush shenesavim mimena elamus. That's not even the ikar of the Eibishter. Even when he chooses, it's not reflective of him himself. So then what is it exactly? So the real question, the biggest dilemma of all, which I mentioned many times, but I'm going to mention here more specifically, really goes back to a bigger question, and that is, why did the Eibishter create existence in the first place? Before we ask why there's Ohr, you have to ask why there's anything, period. Why is there Metzias B'chlal? So we all know there's different Taimei HaBriyah, brought in the Mukabalim, by the Rebbe brings it in the Likutei Sichos Chelik Vav, Shemais. The reason for Legalish Shleimus Kechesov, says in Eitz Chaim, Eibishter wanted to reveal his potential, his abilities. There's the reason Yakiru Gdulase or Bagin Dish Tamudin Bey, that there should be someone that recognizes him, Makabel, that appreciates the Eibishter. And then there's the ultimate reason, Tachlis Saba, from all the reasons, is Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Leis Baruch Dirbe Tachtenim, Alter Rebbe Pedek Lamed Vov and Tanya, Samach Vav, the first Maimon, Tavshem Beis, the Rosh Hashanah Maimorim. That's the places where this is discussed. So let's go with Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Leis Baruch Dirbe Tachtenim. That means you need to have Tachtenim, which is, of course, Tachten Shein Tachten L'Matam Men is our world. And you want it to be a Dira Leis Baruch. So you need two different things here, which are actually opposites. Dira Leis Baruch and Tachtenim are as opposite as it gets. The Alter Rebbe explains what's the meaning of Tachtenim in Pedek Lamed Vov. What does he say? It's not Tachtenim b'mokim. There's no physical space. It's Tachtenim in Gilei Elikus, or in Helam of Elikus. That is the lowest world, as in the deepest Helam. To the point it's Achesher Kafel Mechupel, Helam Vehesten, Ad Shemole Klippus B'Sitra Achre, Ad She'emni Maniva Av Si'ed. Now, what's the antithesis? The exact opposite of Ein Eg Mulvade is Ani Av Si'ed. Ein Eid Milvadeh means there's nothing but the Eibishter. Ani v'Avsei, there's nothing but me. So it couldn't be too much more opposites, Dira and Tachtenim. And yet this is what's Nesava. And Adrab, the Alter Rebbe says that the elements of Yenim, even though they're also Mitzias, they can't be the Tam Abriya because Heil Lehem Yirid Me'er Panav Yizbarach. Different explanations for that. What's relevant to us, can't be the Tach. Atzilus can't be Tach Abriya because what does the Eibishter need? A world where you already have Gilei Elokus. What's the Chiddush? Adrab, Gilei Elokus is always in a higher world, not in a lower world. So where's the Tachlis Tafkid Tachtenim? The Eibishter wants the mamish opposite of him, so to speak, in Giluyim, should be makir and ultimately be a didalei Yizbarach, which is why the Mishkan is built Dafkin Elam Hazeh, from Dvarim Gashmim, etc., etc. And really, this is the Tachlis Abriya that for all why the Neshama comes down Lamata, Lamayla and Gan Eden, the Neshama has much higher Hasagas and Hergeshim. Like he says, even a Tzaddik Gomor can't compare his Aveda below in a guf, Gashmi and Elam Hazeh, to how it is Lamayla without a guf. And yet, Tachlis HaYirida and the Neshama B'guf is to make a Dira B'Tachtein. Yeah, the Neshama will get an Aliyah through it. That's another discussion. So here comes the question. Since the Eibishter wanted everything should be in Tachtenim, which means it has to be in the Lashon of Chassidus, Gidrei Tachtenim, so it has to make sense to Tachtenim. If you'd say, you know what, these two opposites can come together, how? Kol Yochel. Kol Yochel, so you're back to the Eibishter doing it. That's not Tachtenim. So if you say, in other words, to make a Dira B'Tachtenim, you need Kol Yochel, so that's Koyach HaKadosh Baruch, Koyach Yizbarach. It's not our Koyach. How can Tachtenim reconcile and connect to something that's mamish the opposite of our hergish, of the yesh, like you said, ad kadei kach ani v'afsiyed. And you don't need rayas. Just look in the mirror, just your own feelings to know. It's one of the things you don't need a raya for from Chassidus, that we are yesh. Just look at what's most important to you. So how do you explain this? And this is the answer. This is the question that plagues from the beginning when Torah was given. This was always a question. How is it done? So generally, the answer is that's why the Eibishter gave Torah mitzvahs. Torah mitzvahs are not man-made. They're the Eibishter's Torah. Chachmasir Tzena Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he gave us tools, like he says in Perek Lamed Vav, that Ein Ezel Torah, Hashem Ezel Ame Yited. He gave them the koyach to make a Dira B'Tachtenim by giving them a koyach eliki. Now with our b'chira, through Hayagiyah B'Teira and the Kima Mitzvahs and Tefillah and so on, we, with those tools, can make a Dira, because we're using the keiches of the Eibishter. So it's not Kol Yochel, is the Eibishter is giving us these keiches. But still, it still begs the question, you still have two opposites here. Fine, so Torah teaches us how to, and mitzvahs teaches us how to take, let's say, Yad Gashmi, instead of it being Yesh, Ani v'Avsiyeh, you give a Yad Mechalek as Zdokah. You use your hand to give Zdokah. You use your head to learn Torah, etc. With all the Evrei Haguf and all the Keiches HaNefesh, you use them all, Mahu Chanun, Afat Chanun. But that still doesn't explain how Tachtenim Mamish become a Dira Leizbar. That means that even though there's Tachtenim, we have a way back, so to speak. In other words, it's not Tachlis Hel and Behester where you can't connect to the Eibishter. You could. The Welt is Taka Tachtenim. But you still don't have an answer. How can you really bring together these two opposites? What you have here is that a human being can connect to the Eibishter. And as I explained, I believe, last week, and a number of times here in the Shiurim, that would explain only Maisa Mitzvahs, like an Eved and a Melech. That even though the Eibishter is a Melech, and Melech Malchem Lochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the human being is an Eved, so the answer is the Eved could be Meshubet to the Eibishter by doing mitzvahs, Maisa Mitzvahs. But that's it. Is that called a Dira B'Tachtenim? Or is that called that even though you're in Tachten, you're able to follow what Eibishter wants? So here is where Kabbalah, and it's a strong statement I'm going to say, but it says in a number of places that Rebbe speaks about it as well. Kabbalah, and especially Chassidus, comes to answer this big, big question. Where is there a place that there's an interface, a mamutza, that is both Elokus Mamish, pure Elokus, but also something that we can relate to? Because again, if it's Atzmus, the Eibishter himself, Shalei Be'erech. And I'll use this language. You've heard this before, these terms. You talk about atzmus mamish. So there's an expression, 3 expressions I use in Chassidus. Some taken from the Rambam and from other places to express how atzmus is different than Metzias HaNivroim. And this is critical to the discussion here. The 3 expressions are that the Eibush is a Metzias built in Metzias Nimtza, whereas everything else is a Metzias Nimtza. I'll explain in a moment what that means. Second thing is the Eibush is Metziuse Matzmuse. This is actually the Alter Rebbe's own language, not found before, in a Geras HaKedesh Simachov. And the third is the Eibush is Mechuyev HaMetzias. So Nivroim, no matter what Nivroim, Netzalim or Nivroim, everything, even the highest levels of Ohr Ain Sof, don't have these 3 elements. Metzias built, everything is Metzias Nimtza. Everything is not Metzias Matzmuse, which means that its Metzias comes from itself. Everything has a Mokir. Ohr has a Moir, even the highest levels. And finally, Mechuyev HaMetzias means something that must exist. Nothing must exist except Atzmus. So this is what really makes the question much bigger. How can we connect to something that we don't have anything of it within us? Now, what does Metzias built to Metzias Nimtza mean, and what does Metzias Nimtza mean? Metzias Nimtza means, in simple terms, when you ask a question, what is it? What exists? How do you know something exists? How do you know this table exists? So the answer, most people will say, I see it, I could touch it, I could feel it, I can, my 5 senses, Riyah, Shmiyah, Reach, Tam, and Mishush can relate to it. That's the usual answer. How do you know there's a thing called Seichel and or love? The answer is I can't touch it, but I experience it. You know, when you think, you know there's Seichel. We can communicate with each other Seichelic ideas. You have Hergeshim, Midas, Ava, or other feelings. So there you have other tools to know. So in other words, everything that what we call Metzias Nimtza means that it has to have some way that you define it. It has to have a measure, terms, that you define it, whether it's a physical space or it's conceptual space. No? So everything has a way that you define it. If you say something exists and I ask you, tell me what is its parameters, define it for me. And you say, I can't define it, I would say it doesn't exist. That's what you would say. It's not Nimtza. So everything in life, and everything in Kal Seder Gan Seder Shtalshlus is in the gather of Metzias Nimtza because it's defined. And definition means it's this and it's not that. It's a table and it's not a chair. It's an apple and it's not an orange. It's Ohr and it's not a Keli. It's Keli and not a Ohr. That means a definition. What about Atzmus? You can't say that Atzmus is defined in any way. You can't say, therefore, that he's a Metzias Nimtza the way we define a Metzias Nimtza. You also can't say, Chaz v'shalom, that God doesn't exist. So there's an expression that Rambam uses in Meir Nevuchim and cited in Chassidus in many places. It's a Metzias, but it's a Metzias built in Metzias Nimtza. Basically, he's saying it's not existent. You can't say it's existent like everything else. You can't say it doesn't exist. Chaz v'shalom. So you say it doesn't exist, basically. That's what it means. I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around it, but you could do it through Shlila, Yediyas HaShlila, by seeing anything in this world, or anything in existence. If I said to you, how many trees are there in the world? You'd say, let's say there's 1 billion trees in the world. I don't know if that's even accurate. I didn't look it up. And then I would tell you, you know what? It's 1 billion minus 1. You wouldn't say, that's impossible. Why? Because no tree has to exist. As a matter of fact, all the 1 billion trees could disappear, and that's that. But there's nothing that must be. There's no mechuyev. I'm going to the second definition, mechuyev hametzias. Everything could be, could not exist. You were born. The Eibishter wanted you to be born. If you were never born, no one would even know about it, because no one's missing you, because you weren't expected. So everything that exists had a period when it didn't exist. And it doesn't have to exist. Yes, the Eibishter could say, I want you to be here, and therefore you have to be here. But that's because of the Ratzon Hashem, not on its own. There's nothing that you can look in this world and say, if it didn't exist, I'd be shocked. Or everything was. There's nothing such a thing. There's no such thing as mechuyev hametzias b'chlal. Everything is here and has a purpose. Not saying it doesn't have a purpose, but it's here. But it doesn't have anything about the metzias of itself that says it has to be. And finally, the third thing, even though I said it in the second order, Metzusim Atzmusei, that's the easiest. Metzusim Atzmusei, says the Alter Rebbe, means that the Metzius itself comes from within itself. Basically, it creates itself. I don't want to use the word create because you can't say that in the Eibishter, but its existence comes because it has to exist from within itself. Nothing is like that because everything has a mocker. You have parents, your parents have parents. Everything has something that put it here. Even the Daimon Sameachai Medaber or anything in existence has to have something that put it there. Even Ohr, as I said before, has to have the Mahava Ohr, has to have the Mokkara Ohr. So here it makes the question therefore much stronger now. Can we connect to Atzmus on those levels, the Atzmus that's different than in us in every possible way? So the easiest answer would be, no, we can't. We can't connect. So rest at peace that you can only reach the Elikus that's in the Geder of Metzias Nimtze, or Elikus that's in the Geder that relates to a Metzias that's not Mechuyev HaMetzias, and a Metzias that's not Metzias Matzmusei. However, and this is interesting, there's no mocker for this, but as the Rebbe said once in a Fabrengen, Azay Alter Rebbe eingestellt, that we want to connect all the way to Atzmus itself. Now there are rayas for it. I mentioned last week the rayas when you say Ata Reis Ladas, V'yedai Tayim V'Shaves Levavecha, Das Alekei Avicha V'Haftas Hashem Alekecha. Now those rayas are not muchrich that it's Atzmus Mamish. You could always say V'Hafta is the Dargis of Elikus that we relate to, or Das Alekei Avicha V'yedai only to a certain connection. But it's very clear from Chassidus, Chabad especially, that there wants to be a connection all the way to Atzmus. So here's where the dilemma is. How can you explain such a thing without using Kol Yochel? And that's where Ohr Ain Sof comes into play. That in order for the Eibishter to create an existence, number one, that can make sense to us, an existence that's completely Shalei Be'erech to him, and number two, a way that we can connect to the Eibishter on our terms, Tachtenim, that doesn't require a Kol Yochel power. So the Eibishter wanted to create something, put something in place that will allow, let's call it a place like the Beloshen HaPosuk, V'ne'adati l'cha shama. What does the Posuk say about the Mishkan? The Eibishter says to Moshe, build a Mishkan, V'ne'adati l'cha shama. I will meet you there. It's a meeting place. Now we also know Ne'adati is from the word Yud. It's more than just a meeting place. It's like the word Moyed comes from that, and or like a Moyed as in a Yom Tov. It's a meeting place in time. And the Na'adati also comes from the word Yud as in marriage. It's intimacy. But basically, Ohr Ain Sof, as we'll talk about in a few moments, is essentially a nivra of the Eibishter. I'm especially using the word nivra, even though you could say, one second, Ohr is not a nivra, it's Ohr and Moed. But there's an aspect that it is a creation because it didn't have to be. So the Eibishter wanted it. But it's a Metzias that has a paradox to it. It's like the classic meturgeman, if you wish. Not literally a translator, but on one hand, it's kuli elikus. It doesn't have anything of its own. It is completely bottled to the moyer, has no rotzen la'atzmei, even ergashmi. It's completely me'ein hamoyer and bottled to the moyer. It's not the moyer, but it's completely nothing but elikus. On the other hand, it's already Metzias Nimtza. That's the big chiddush. It's not Metzias Matzmusei. It's not built in Metzias Nimtza. It's not Mechuyev HaMetzias. So this paradox is the essence of Ohr. Now, once you have this, now you have a place at least that we can talk about. It's still high levels. There's still going to need to be a tzimtzum and a lot of other things before we can relate to this Ohr. But you have at least something that's not Atzmus, but it's also not Atzmus. And that creates the ultimate space, if you wish, space. You know, I like to envision it sometimes if you want to use it. So since we have Seichel Gashmi, we have to sometimes imagine things. So think of it like an infinite quilt. I don't know if you know what a quilt is. Like an infinite blanket. With Abish to create what we would call in physics, they would call it a field of energy. You know, a field of energy that does not have any shape, has no form, there's no spheres, there's not even a rotz in there. So this emphasized, this is all before anything that you can define. It's a pshitas dika, it is composher betachlis pshitas, and yet it's not pure atzmus as in the Metzias built in Metzias Nimtza, and it's not atzmus, because it doesn't have any Metzias la'atzmei. Basically, if you want to put it in practical terms, the Eibishter created the concept of bittel, Metzias ha-bittel. So Eir really, even though we translate Eir energy, some translate as light, all these translations are correct technically, but what does it mean, light? Sunlight, daylight, a flame gives off light. What does it mean by light? You say the word light. It's not, you can't just get away by saying there's God and God gave off light. As always, the translations you'll hear in any class on Eir. What does it mean, give off light? So the example is, okay, just like the Shemesh is the Etzem HaShemesh and the light reflects or reveals. In that sense, it's correct. It's Hispashtus, it's a Gilui. So the first thing is Eir is Kol Mehusei is Bittel, and the second thing, Eir Kol Inyane is Gilui. Gilui. Now, Gilui doesn't mean the opposite of Helam in this case, because Gilui could also be Megala Koyach HaHelam. Gilui means that the Eibishter now created an entity that is subject to expression. And I'll just use a Moshel Gashmi, which Chassidus doesn't mamish give this Moshel, but it's mashma like this in a lot of places. Every person here, every one of you, we all have a nefesh. We'll call it the Etzem HaNefesh. We all know the expression, Etzem HaNefesh. Etzem HaNefesh on its own is something you can't touch, you can't define, you can't even relate to it. It's just there behind the scenes. So what do we relate to? We relate to the Ohr Ain Nefesh. The nefesh as it expresses itself. Now it could express itself based on kloli, it gives you life. The chai is kloli. Called the chai is kloli. It's in you that gives you life from head to toe. You're a living human being. After Me'eva Hashem Shana, the nefesh and the guf separate, the body's no longer alive. So it's like a force, you could call it electricity, energy, light, whatever you want to call it. But that's not enough. In the Ohr Ain Nefesh, there's also Keiches HaNefesh. As the Alter Rebbe says in Peri Gimel, in Tanya, that's Kol Mekeiches, Eser Keiches. What are the Eser Keiches? Chochmeh, Chabad, Chagas, Nihim. And these are the faculties through which the Nefesh expresses itself. Now just let's imagine for a moment that we only had Etzem HaNefesh, and there's no Ohr, and there's no Keiches HaNefesh. What would life be like? Would be like that you and I can never communicate with each other. Two people can never connect. There's no relationships. Because all there is Etzem HaNefesh here and Etzem HaNefesh here, and that's it. It doesn't manifest in any way, it doesn't express itself, and definitely not in details. Now, on the other hand, people can speak to each other like we're doing now, and you're speaking doesn't mean you're speaking things from your Etzem HaNefesh. You can be speaking about Narishkeiten too. What the weather is like, sports. I'm not talking about necessarily Dvarim Asurim. Dvarim B'Teilim, Stam. Now, the ultimate communication, the ultimate connection between two individuals is when you're able to express your Etzem HaNefesh through the Keiches HaNefesh, through Machshava Dibur Maisa, and then you have what's called Nafshik Shuri B'Nafshi, or the Frierdiker Rebbe explains the Yechidus. When you went to Yechidus to the Rebbe, it was Yechida of the Chassid meeting Yechida of the Rebbe, or other such expressions. Or even when we say soulmates. What's ultimately soulmates? Not just two people who are friends. There's a Hoya Lebasar Echad. They become one flesh. Why? Because they were both Zach and Nekeva Bara Esam. They were both part of one entity. The Eibishter then split them into two. So that Tselem Elikim is complete when you have the Zach and Nekeva come together. It's just a plagufa, soulmates as they say it, however you want to express it. The point I'm making here is that if you have Etzem without Ohr, you don't have a relationship that we can understand. Again, Kol Yochel Eibishter can do anything. He can create us and have a relationship with us, and we have no clue how. That's not the Tachtenim. That defies, that goes against Tachtenim. That goes against every rule that we know. So Ohr becomes basically the Eibishter's creation of something where the built-in Metzias Nimtza has now manifested in the Metzias Nimtza, which leaves room now for anything that will come afterwards. Will all be a Metzias Nimtza, but through Ohr it connects all the way to the Mokir, to Atzmus itself. This is the general explanation. Now there's still some dilemmas here, obviously. It's not solved. If it was so simple, we wouldn't need to have hundreds of Maimonim on this topic. Because here comes a question, you could just say, okay, this carries over the question only for number one. Fine. You now explain how there's a dargah, so to speak, a level that's not Asmus, but it's also not a nivra, because it's bottled completely to Atzmus. But then where does Milta Metzias Nimtza and Metzias Nimtza connect between Ohr and Atzmus? Because Atzmus still remains removed, as the Maimonim speak about, that Ohr is as distant from Atzmus as the Yesh Gashmi, when you talk about Milta Metzias Nimtza. Because the Eibishter is not a Moir, he's not Mugdir in being a Moir. The sunlight reveals the sun. So it has something in common. It's Taka Shalei Be'erech, it's a Ha'ara, but it's sunlight, it's not moonlight. It's not a tree, it's not a stone. But the Eibishter, you can't say the Ohr is a reflection of the very nature of Atzmus, because Atzmus is Shalei Berech to Ohr too. I mentioned before, Lo Zeh Ikar Lakush and Esav Mena Ohr. Question number one. Number two is, okay, so how did the Mukabbalah understand it before Chassidus? If you need Ohr, and the Alter Rebbe's Chiddush is an Inya Ohr, like I mentioned from Vayelach, how do they understand it? So here, I'm going to summarize the Maimon Vayelach Samach Vav now, briefly, which, as I said, is miyusad on Samach Tzedek's Lahavin, actually the Alter Rebbe, but Samach Tzedek's Hanocha of, or explanation of Lahavin in Ohr Ain Sof. And he answers this direct question of what is the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe in Ohr Legabe the Mukabalim Harashenim. And he primarily talks about two different opinions, the Ramak, Ramoshe Cordovero, and Ameh, who they were contemporaries. And the discussion is exactly this issue, this memutza between Elikus and Welt, or Elikus and Metzias. They don't use the language built to Metzias Nimtza, just for the record. So clearly they're speaking maybe on a lower level, but regardless, the machlekas that they have is regarding this connection between Elikus and Metzias Elements. So in Kabbalah, the big level that's important to know is the level of Keser. Keser in language Bilaz is Rotzen. Rotzen Hashem. So here's this disagreement. Is Keser Ein Sof or not? There's a whole Ramak, there's a whole section in the Pardes of the Ramak, a whole shar where he talks about Ima Keser Hua Ein Sof. And he brings them different Mukabalim on this. Is it Ein Sof or is it Gvul, basically? Is it one of the spheres, like as a Hamshacha Gvulis, a limited Hamshacha, or is it Ein Sof, which means referring to the Eibishter himself, Ein Sof? And in different words, is the Rotzen Hashem like the Eibishter, or is the Rotzen Hashem more like a creation? And the difference is, each one has a mile over the other. If Keser is Ein Sof, so then there's a connection to Ein Sof. That means we can connect to the Eibishter through his Rotzen. On the other hand, to say that Rotzen is Ein Sof would be saying that the Eibishter is Mugder in a Geder called Rotzen. Rotzen is a Geder. We mentioned before, no matter what, it's a definition. Rotzen is not Tainuk. Rotzen is not Chochmeh. Rotzen is a Geder. To say that Atzmus, even though they don't use the word Atzmus, they use the word Ein Sof, is Rotzen, is a problem. So the Ramah goes, you can't say Rotzen is Ein Sof. You could say Ein Sof wants to have a Rotzen, basically a Rotzen to a Rotzen in Kav Yochel. The Rameh, on the other hand, says that Ein Sof is Rotzen. The difference would be, like in any Memutza, one, you're connecting more to the Eibishter, but it's not about the Nivroim so much. You have to basically be Mavat yourself to connect there, because a Nivra is not one with Ein Sof. On the other hand, if Rotzen is not Ein Sof, so we connect to Rotzen, because Rotzen relates to us, Rotzen Hashem, that he wants to have a Nivra, he wants to have a Tzelem Elikim, and he wants to give us Torah and mitzvahs. And the Vayelech, he goes back and forth about the mile of each of these opinions, and that's where he says, that the Alter Rebbe comes and adds one dimension that they both don't talk about. By them, it's either Ein Sof or Rotzen, or Ein Sof and Keser. And the Alter Rebbe adds between the two, Ohr Ain Sof. That once you have Ohr, so the notion there is Narviach, he says, we have both miles. On one hand, it's not a dargin. Ohr is poshet, betachlis apshitis. It's not like Rotzen that has a tziyur. On the other hand, it's also not atzmus. So basically, he says it has both milas on both these shittis and Kabbalah. So what do you have? What's the conclusion from this? Is that Ohr is a whole dargah that is a fascinating one, because in some ways, it does something that Kav Yochel Atzmus itself doesn't do. even though Ohr is completely from Atzmus, but it's able, that Atzmus is able to do two things at once. Bring so-called his Kavyochel core built in Metzias Nimtza and Metzias Atzmus and Mechuyev Metzias personality into a Metzias Nimtza. And the reason that's possible is because Ohr is a bottle betachlis ha-bittel, poshet betachlis ha-pshitas. And that's the key thing, that before the Alter Rebbe, you don't have that musig spelled out so much. Now, it's not to say they didn't know it. Maybe they did know. It's like Mishnah and Gemara. Everything has its time. But the bottom line is, in Chassidus Chabad, this is the main chiddush. Now, to answer the question, the other question I asked, which is, so where does Ohr meet Atzmus, so to speak? Since it's built in Metzias Nimtza, Ohr is Metzias Nimtza, so what did we really accomplish? We moved out of Atzmus, so to speak, and we're now into another gather, which is called Metzias Nimtza. It's not Mechuyev HaMetzias, and so on. So you probably have heard the Lashon, some Amorim. He says it also in Vayelach, some of Vov, that there's the level of Ohr that's Kol Ba'atzmus, and it's Kodem Kikadmusei. You've heard this expression? Kodem Kikadmusei. It's a very strong statement. Now I'll introduce another expression that also says in the same Amorim, that he said there's a thing called Kodmo Aheder, and there's Ke'ein Shekodmo Aheder. What does that mean? That, for example, you could say that Ohr was here always, from the beginning, from whenever the Eibishter wants it to be, it was always there. But still, it's Ke'ein Kodmo Aheder because it doesn't have to be. In Inyan, it has a Sibba and a Mesubav. The Sibba is Atzmus, and Ohr is a Mesubav. So even though the Mesubav could be always there, but it's still, Be'etzem Inyan, it's not the Mokker. You can't Chaz v'Shalom say that the Beira is Ohr. You could say Ohr carries the Keyach HaBriya. So in Anochi Samach Zayin, also in Hemshech Samach Vov, Anochi Tafrei Samach Zayin, the Alter Rebbe Rashab asks a question, since Ohr is Shalei Berech to Atzmus just like everything else, so what did we gain with Ohr? Why can't we then so say that it's Kol Yochel again, the Eibishter Kol Yochel? So then what does Ohr accomplish, so to speak, since it's also not Atzmus, and Shalei Berech to Atzmus? So he answers there, he says 3 reasons. He says Aleph Beis Gimel. 3 reasons. I'm not going to go through all the reasons, but I'll just give you the summation of it. What he comes away and says is that the Eibishter wanted everything to be Beseder v'Hadraga. This is the second reason he gives. He wanted everything to be organized. In other words, to say that there'd be a leap, Atzmus creates Tachtenim, and there's no Ohr, and there's no Seder Shtalshus, and nothing, that would be like saying your Etzem HaNefesh communicates with mine without Keiches HaNefesh, without Machshava Dibra Mais, without anything. It's a completely illogical, impossible to understand. Since he wanted it to be Al Pi Seichel, so he wanted it to be in an orderly way, so the first step is create a Darge that's Takesh Shalei Be'erech, but at least it's not Hepech of Atzmus. Because Ohr has no Metzias except Atzmus. It's completely Batel B'Tachlis HaBittel. So from the point of view of Atzmus, Taka Ohr is Shalei Berech. But from the point of view of Ohr is completely Batel Metzias to the Eibishter. It's almost just to give it a little more tangible expression. It's a little what it says in the Sichos, the Tain of Keirach. What does Keirach say? Madua Tisnasu. Right? Why do we need a Moshe and Aaron and leaders? Everybody is holy. So what do we need teachers? What do we need Rosh Yeshiva? What do you need Alamdim? What do you need a Rebbe for? Everybody is a chelik elakam imal mamish, is connected straight to the Eibishter. What do you need to have all these so-called memutzoyim? And we know in Teda, everybody connects straight to the Eibishter. So the answer is the same question. I remember once we wrote to the Rebbe, similar question about something else, and the Rebbe said, according to your question, what do you need Atzilus for? What do you need Bria for? Then the Elam Hazeh Gashmi was created by the Eibishter. What do we need Atzilus for? The same thing, what do you need Ohr? Because you need something that reflects a Lakus. Keirach's mistake was that, yes, Kol Eidik Deishim Hem, no problem. But how do they connect? Mitzidon, on their level, Darga Ache Darga. So you need to have Chinuch, you need to learn, so you need to have a teacher, you need to have a Rav, you need to grow level by level, ben Chomesh LaMikra, ben Nesel LaMishnah, ben Chamesh Esel LaGemara, etc. That's the way it is. If not, it would be not Beseder V'Adroga. It would be a leap, which wouldn't make sense to us. It would be like saying someone was born As soon as they're born, they're Agon Adir. There's no such thing. Even the Gresta God, even the Alter Rebbe, and all the greatest Gaonim were born as children. Yes, they had the potential, the Keiches, Butzim, Mekat Fiyadiyah, etc., but they had to go through Yigiyah. They learned and they grow and so on. So they grew faster, and even when they were young, they're already seen as being Yiluyim, etc. So to bring it back to, say, the Shtalshel, is the same thing in the Elam Kotten Zeh is also in the big picture. Oyer is essentially the first step, because it's not Hepech HaVelikus in any way, Chaz v'Shalom, Punkt Verkehrt. Without Oyer is completely always Dovuk and bottled to the Moyer. All the Maimorim, that's what they talk about. The question is the level of Dveikus and lower levels, higher levels, but Oyer never loses its personality as always. If there's Oyer, there's a Moyer. The Yesh is not like that. The Yesh Anivra does not say if there's a Yesh, there's a Boyer. Yes, Seichel is Mechayev. It doesn't, Begilu, it's not that way. If you see sunlight, you don't have to see the sun. You know there's a sun. So if you see an expression, you know that right away it's coming from somewhere. So what Eir introduces is the concept of Bitl and Gilui that we can relate to. And on the highest levels, all it is a reflection of Atzmus. And this leads me now to the final point with the Kodem Kekadmuse. Because of its Bitl, this is one of the big Chidushim also in Chassidus, that Bitl doesn't mean that you lose everything and you become annihilated. It's not like Heishi that's boy and the Malach burns up. It's much deeper than that. Bitl means that when you're bottled to your Mokir, you become part of the Mokir. As a matter of fact, you become an extension of the Mokir. There's an expression that Rebbe, I heard this from Rabbi Yael, and the Maimer of Hemshech Tzadik Daled from the Friedrich Rebbe. So he talks about Ruchnius and Eir, some of the themes I'm talking about here as well. And I'm not sure if the Rebbe said the expression or that was understood in Yechidus when the Rebbe was explaining a ha'ara that he wrote in that Maimer. There's an ha'ara about Machzas HaShekel. Not here in the Gei here so much. I spoke about it last Sunday. They had for the Shleishim a symposium on Agdus. So the expression was, which is a mind-blowing expression, Bittel kenish bottle then. That's what the Rebbe said. Or at least the Lashon or the Teichen. Bittel kenish bottle then. Think about that. Everything in this world can be bottled. Just as it has a scholar, it has a sof. Everything was born, dies. That's how it is. That's the gather of a Metzias, as I said before. But what about Bittel? Bittel kenish bottle then. You know why? Because the more it's bottled, the more it becomes in existence. Its whole Metzias is Bittel. Now, if you apply that to Ohr Ain Sof, so the Bittel of Eir is ad kedei kach that it assumes the personality of the thing that it's bottled to. So though you can't say that Eir is Atzmus, but because of its Bittel, it becomes just like Atzmus. Because there's Chaz v'Shalom to say two things become like one if the thing is a Metzias. But if it's Kol Inyan is Bittel, to put it in simple English, if you're dedicated to something, to yourself, so you're as strong as you are. But if you're dedicated to a cause, or you're dedicated to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe's Inyanim, so you become then an extension of those Inyanim. Now, if those Inyanim happen to be Nitzchim, so you become an extension of Nitzchis. Not that you mitzad atzmei are Nitzchi. It's your bittul that allows you to become what we call in simple English a transparent channel that's not getting in the way. So the only thing is you're like an extension of the flow of whatever your mukkah is. If you're bittul, that's the Tanai. There's a very interesting letter in Tafshin Chavov. It was 100 years from the Tzemach Tzedek's Stalkus. Pesach, Yud Gimel Nissen. So in the letter, the Rebbe writes, the whole letter is about the Tzemach Tzedek, and he brings out the Tzemach Tzedek, like he gives maybe 10 titles. It was a Gon, and a Makubal, and a Rebbe, and a Manik, a Ganze, the whole thing. And says, and we have to learn from the Tzemach Tzedek. Then the Rebbe asks a question, and says, Mi Yidme, Mi Yishvele. How can we learn from a person of that caliber? There's nothing comparable. And the Rebbe gives a mashal. It's an interesting mashal. He says that just like the ocean reflects the sun, so too every drop of water reflects the whole sun. Not less than the entire ocean. You take a drop of water, it reflects the moed, the sun, just like the ocean. But the Rebbe says there are three tanoim. The water has to be rain. Just remember rain. He uses 3 words in Yiddish. Rain, klor, rain, and zav zayin neged hashemesh, has to face the shemesh. In other words, the water has to be bottled. If the water is not clean, has some dirt in it, it's not going to reflect the sun. If it's not clear and transparent, also won't. And if it's not facing the sun, obviously it's not going to be. In other words, if it's not bottled like it's makusher to the mocker. That's what the Rebbe says. So I always thought of it that if you think about it, it's mamish what Ohr Ain Sof is. Ohr Ain Sof is a pure, without any other agenda, not even a rotzen, not even Sfiris Ein Ketz, Chassidus talks about. It's a pure reflection of its mocker. So though it's a Metzias Nimtza on its own, but if it's a pure reflection of Bilta Metzias Nimtza, it will give us also a taste of Bilta Metzias Nimtza. Not Mitzad Atzmei. It would be exactly like a shliach, shluchish l'odem kamesei. He can bring the Rebbe to another person. He's not the Rebbe. No one shliach will ever say he's the Rebbe. But his bittul to the Rebbe allows him to be pi halacha, like a yad arucha, like he's like an extension. That's just how you apply it in Peil Mamish. So Ohr ultimately, therefore, has that element. So besides being a so-called memutza, a place now where Metzias Nimtza can connect Elokus in the purest and the highest levels. More than that, it's also a dugma chaya, so to speak, for bittul. The ultimate bit, when you learn about Ohr, you're learning really what is true bittul. And for a yesh like us, a yesh anivra, which our mokir is from Amatzusim Atzmusif, from Atzmus, like the Alter Rebbe says in the Geras Kedes Simachov. But he says that the Eibishter creates this yesh through Ohr. And he says they're Lashon, Ohr me'ena moed. Since Ohr is me'ena moed, it can carry the koyach ha'briya. Jahu levade b'keicha v'yecholte. Only the Eibishter can create yesh ma'ayin. Ve'efes ha'muchlet she'en le'ilu v'siba, like he says there. Who carries it, however? Ohr. Because Ohr is, so to speak, a shliach without any agendas. It has no other thing except following whatever the mocker wants it to do. So B'meila Ohr carries this and becomes a dugma for us that we can relate to. You want to have an example of bittul? Look at Ohr. So with that, you have some picture about what the role of Ohr is, what its purpose is, and why the Eibishter created it. I want to just conclude on I already said a practical application. But the real chiddush, of course, is that we're not Ohr. We are a yesh. The Eibishter didn't create us as Ohr. You're not a walking dugma chaya like Ovis Hein Amrakova, that when you look at you see the moyer. At least I think most of us are not in that madreg. We're not created to be that way. We're created to be befedish yesh anivra. However, the biggest chiddush is that through our Aveda, we combine both milas. The mile of a yesh that behaves like Ohr. So the ultimate purpose of Ohr is that we incorporate it in our lives, and that's through bittul. It's really, bottom line is bittul, the yesod of everything. The whole concept of shlichus, and I don't just mean it as a card-carrying member of shliach. I mean to say the concept that the Rebbe says what a shliach is. The Alter Rebbe says in L'Kutei Torah in Vayikra, something pretty mind-blowing. Long before we understood the concept of shliach, the Alter Rebbe says that everything that's not atzmus is a shliach. Because Ohr Ain Sof itself is a shliach of the Eibishter to carry. He says they prefer the word shliach. And shluchei shel odem kamesei, and he adds mamish. It's all in the L'Kutei Torah Vayikra. So anything that's not the mokked itself is already a shliach. So now you apply that to our personal Aveda. We're zeichet to be the Rebbe's talmidim and children and shluchim, no matter what you end up doing. The Rebbe is a shliach. What does it really mean? It means you're a yesh. Like the Rebbe says in all the sikhs, what does he say? He says, a shliach has to have two hofchim. Mamish, like I started out, hofchim. On one hand, a shliach must be a bardas, b'fnei atzmei. A cheresh sheitav v'katan can be a shliach. A child can be a shliach. You can't have a shliach, has to be an independent entity that its own volition chose to be your shliach. So it has to be mamash adover nifrid b'fnei atzmei. But at the same time, it has to be completely bottled to the mashaleach. If there's moyel b'shlichusei, if in any way changes, or he thinks he's a shutef, not a shliach, he is bottled shlichusei. because he's no longer an extension. So if you put it in the aces that we spoke about here now, it's a yesh that behaves like oir, a yesh that chooses to be completely bottled to the moker, to atzmus, or to the mashalech in this example, and fulfills, even though it has its own deya b'fnei atzmei, it's mechaven, and all its inyan is to fulfill what the mashalech wants it to do, which is the biggest chiddush of all, because for oir to be bottled doesn't take any work. Oir is created as bittul. Oir Hashem doesn't have to work on becoming bottled. So by us, it takes a lot of work. But that creates ultimately the chibur, where you really have, when you say dira b'tachtenim, dira leizbo, dira la'atzmusei, that's built in Mitzias Nimsa, the yesha amiti, Mitziasim atzmusei, but it's and at the same time, and it's in tachtenim, and at the same time, it's begili like a dira, because you have the combination of the yesh, who's chosen through Araveda to be like Eira Leki, to be completely bottled. Mashiach comes, that's when it'll be b'shlemus, both milas. There'll be beferish atachten, but the tachten will be radiating. Like the Rebbe says, v'nigla kved Hashem v'ro kol basar, not called ene basar. Basar itself, the yesh itself, will see elikus nigla. That's the chibur of yesh and eir. Okay, thank you. Everyone have a great day.